Yeah, so I'm, as you mentioned, I'm a PhD student working with the stingless bees. So I'm coming back to the bee topic. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I'm doing for my PhD and about the resource they collect and the nutritional requirements. So as you, I cannot change it. Yeah. As you may know already, stingless bees are eusocial bees. They have a distribution like tropical distribution and subtropical distribution all around the world. And there's something really typical from these bees is that they have these weird shapes at the entry of the nest. So they are always like kind of like a tube. And they do them with different materials they collect from the forest, but mainly like resins and some mud or some soil. Bees as other bees, stingless bees as other bees, they collect nectar to get the energy, like carbohydrates. They also collect the pollen to get fats and proteins. And the pollen comes like from like the plants, but we still don't know, like the bees seem to be broad proleptic, so they visit different plants to get the pollen. However, some species will forage or fewer or different plant species, and they also may restrict their foraging to understory or canopy. It may be to avoid competition between the bees, the different species, but there are also maybe other differences that we still don't know why they will prefer certain plants above others. As I mentioned you before, for stingless bees, it's really characteristic to collect resin. This resin they can get it from wounded plants, that when the plant is wounded, then they get the resin. But also some plants have a specialized structure where they produce the resin. So in this case, for example, they can get it from flowers. And when they get the resin from the flower, they will pollinate the plant. So resins are mixtures of terpenoids or phenolic compounds. They are used for construction, as I mentioned, so they can have these really nice shapes at the entry of the nest. They also have antibacterial and antifungal properties, so they will use them to build the nest and have them free of pathogens and have a healthy environment. And for all the ant lovers, sorry for the next image. So they are also used for defense. So when some ants want to attack them, for example, they will immediately get the resin and attack the ants, so they will defend themselves. So even though resin is really important for stingless bees, I really want to mention that we can divide the stingless bees in two main groups according to resin collection. That will be the high resin collectors and the low resin collectors. And as an example, I want to show you here this graph. When we see different species and we plot the proportion of returning foragers with nectar, pollen, or resin, or a combination of resin and nectar, we can see, for example, in this species, Tentragona, that they mainly collect only resin or resin and nectar, and they will collect really little pollen. And that arises the question, like, they really need the pollen for survival, so why they collect so little? The question will be, do they have different nutritional requirements, so they need less, or they completely different than the ones that collect mainly only pollen? Or do they collect pollen from different plants, and this other kind of pollen maybe is richer in fats and fatty acids that gives the energy to the bees to survive? So these are the questions I want to address. And knowing this, the importance of resin collection in the relationship of stingless bees and plants will help us to understand better the tropical interaction networks for pollination interaction networks, and also to improve conservational programs. So the objective of my study was to see how the resin collection influenced the returning bees per minute with nectar, pollen, or resin, to see how much they invest workforce for each resource. For the nutritional requirements, we really want to see for the nectar if they collect nectar with higher or less sucrose concentration, and also mainly about the pollen to see if it has a different protein and fat content, and from which plants they get this pollen from. For this, I traveled to Ecuador, so the so-called Choco region. It's in the northwest part of Ecuador. And I stay in two reserves, the Canandé Reserve and Tesoro Escondido Reserve, where I was walking around the forest and look for wild nest. And once I found the nest, I would select 11 of these nests. And during 5 different days, I record the activity of the bees, so to have the returning bees per minute. Then I collected 20 returning foragers and counted how many of these have pollen, resin, and nectar. And with these numbers, then I calculate the returning foragers per minute, which is these resources. When I was collecting the bees, when I look if they have nectar, I also with a capillar collected this nectar, and with a refractometer, I see the sucrose concentration that was made like in the field, the percentage, and then I calculated the sucrose concentration. And also when I got the bees with pollen, I collected this pollen that I later divide to do DNA metabarcoding to see which plants they visited. And I did chemical analysis to see the fatty acids. And I want to do the amino acid analysis that I'm still working on, but I will show you the other results. But before I go to the results, I really want to highlight that I have received a lot of help from many people, for the people in the communities where I work. They helped me to find the bees, and my supervisors and my funding institutions. So now with the results, first to see how many returning foragers come with each resource, or like the returning foragers per minute. Here I plotted the high collectors of resin, and we can see that they really invest much workforce for resin collection, even than pollen and nectar in these 2 species. And one species like mainly or similar nectar and resin, but they really do pollen. So they really invest the workforce for collecting resin. The lower resin collectors, like 2 species, seem to invest similar workforce for the 3 resources, and even some collected more pollen and nectar than resin. When we go to the sucrose in the nectar for part of the nutritional requirements, we saw a little bit like maybe that the high resin collectors might collect a little bit more concentrated nectar, but this difference might be driven mainly by 1 species. Yeah, we see this slight difference here. When we see at the fatty acid content in the pollen, we also see like there is 1 species that seems to collect really like a little bit higher fat content than other species, and we still want to figure out if it's like only these species, or yeah, how that looks later, the better analysis. And now we want to look also at the amino acid concentration in the pollen to see how is this ratio between fats and protein, and if that changes for different species and the resin collection. And our last, but also I think one of our main results, is that when we do an interaction network of the bees and the plants, so from the collected pollen, we do the barcoding, and then I pull all the low resin collectors and the high resin collectors, and then I plot down the plants they visit, they got the pollen from. Even though there is some overlap in the plants they visit, we can see really a difference in the visited plants. So somehow the high resin collectors would go for different plants than the low resin collectors. Now I'm analyzing which is the habitat of these, like the plants, if they have different habitat, or maybe it's the pollen, or if these plants maybe produce resin. So we want to ask these questions. And with this, I would like to conclude like that so far we have found that the resin collection preference influences the foraging activity of the stingless bees. It really influences which plants they collect pollen from, and we want to see if the nutritional requirements also change because of the resin collection. And with this, yeah, I want to thank you all for listening, and thanks to the organizing team. And yeah, I'm happy to listen to your questions or comments.